This is Bruce Geitch, and you're listening to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast.
Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. You've been listening to the music of Jeff Berlin, who's one of the most respected and influential bass players in the history of the instrument. He's probably best known as one of the most sought-after sidemen in the business, but as we're going to hear, he's also released some excellent CDs of his own. The track we just heard is called Everyone Gets Old, If They Have the Time. That's from his Lumpy Jazz CD. When he isn't in the studio or out on tour, he spends his time teaching music. I've really been looking forward to speaking with him about his career, so let's get him on the line. Joining me on the phone from Clearwater, Florida, is Jeff Berlin. Welcome, Jeff.
Hey, it's a pleasure.
The area code might be saying Florida, but the voice is saying Long Island to me.
Yeah, it's a Long Island drogue I got because I grew up on the island. Yeah, I'm a Long Island boy, and I guess you never quite lose your roots. My dad's been in America since 1947, and he speaks English as well as anybody, and he still has an accent.
I lived in Queens, New York for 2 years, and used to go to Jones Beach, etc., Long Island. So I'd kind of place you maybe West Hempstead, and maybe somewhere in the vicinity of Eagle Avenue. I really
well, let me tell you what, if that's where you placed me, you're astonishingly accurate. Because I grew up on Eagle Avenue. I know you researched it. Yeah, I grew up in West Hempstead as a boy, and I lived on Eagle Avenue in West Hempstead. That's correct.
Yeah, well, let's just all be thankful that you didn't grow up on Ego Avenue.
Ego Avenue. Well, some might disagree, but I certainly am an opinionated guy, but if I were really an egotist, I wouldn't really be putting myself out to try to strive to make things better and at the disagreement of some people and stuff. So, no, there's no ego here. I practice way too much and I doubt my playing way too often to really kind of consider myself an egotist of any kind at all.
Well, when Lee Sklar was on the show, he talked about how he started out on classical piano and then he switched to bass. I know yours is a similar situation, that you also excelled on a different instrument before you committed to the bass, which was?
The violin. I was a very good student and practiced quite a lot, had lessons all through my childhood since I was 5 up until about the time I got my first bass. guitar, and then 2 years afterward. I played 10 years of violin. I was a well-trained, I would say, in the specifics and exact elements of music, which had served me. I mean, my classical training sort of flowed into the electric bass and allowed me to function sort of differently because of that. And so violin was excellent for me. Wonderful, wonderful basic training for my career as a bass player.
Yeah, because you're known for the speed of your playing, but fast, complex runs are kind of commonplace for classical violinists. So that technique, if you want to play that way, is certainly going to be useful.
Yes, when I was younger, it was all I wanted to do, and I'm 59 now, 59 and a half, and as you get older, you kind of you don't look at the tempo as the issue anymore. And quite frankly, there's so many amazing bass players now that play twice as fast as I do. Great bass players, twice my ability and technique. So I had to not go the way to try to keep up, but rather to go the way in deeper and deeper into music, so maybe I could find something new. And but I have to give the violin the credit for the beginning steps that I took in order to try to take the bass guitar, not only function in it, let's say, legitimately and acceptably, meaning rhythm section-wise that was expected of me, but to be unreasonable, unique, and hopefully my own approach. If I didn't get that, it doesn't matter. The attitude was I wanted to, and that's sort of the thing about what, let's say, violin set up, that if you can play a series of notes and play music in a melodic manner, why can't you do it on a bass guitar?
I think of Jaco Pastorius as a soloist on the bass. I only think of you guys in the same breath in the sense that you're soloists, virtuosic soloists. I can tell your different playing styles apart.
Right.
But there weren't a lot of people doing that. In fact, I first became aware of you when you played on the Alan Holdsworth album Road Games back in 1983. I found your playing throughout that album to be pretty captivating and certainly on a different level than what I was accustomed to hearing from bass players. I'm going to play a track from that album in a minute, but first I want to talk a little bit about how that project came to be. I know it was produced by Ted Templeman and Eddie Van Halen was involved. What was the story on that?
Alan and I knew each other from, we had met playing with Tony Williams. I had played a very short time with Tony Williams and left the band because they wanted to have a rock trio, and I was still, let's say, growing as a musician, and I needed a pianist to cover that harmony. I didn't want to play a trio. But Alan was there, and who instantly, of course, amazed me. And then we met in Bill Bruford's band, and we became friends from that point on. And Eddie Van Halen was a very big fan of Alan Holdsworth, and when he went to Templeman, when he was the head of Warner Brothers, he had asked if he'd give a record to Alan. I was invited to be the bass player. And it's fascinating how those older sessions still exist. There's a real following for it, and I'm grateful because a lot of music comes and goes, and some of this stuff just seems to have stayed. It's remarkable. It's really quite an honor for me.
I know Alan Holdsworth is very self-critical and doesn't like listening to his older stuff, but for a lot of guitar players, it's really classic stuff. Let's go ahead and listen to a track from Road Games. We're going to play the one that appears to be designed to showcase your soloing ability. Chad Wackerman's on the drums, of course, Alan Holdsworth's on guitar. This is Water on the Brain, Part 2. I know Eddie Van Halen was a fan of Alan Holdsworth's playing. Did Alan ever tell you what he thought of Eddie's playing?
I'm certain he admired it. Everybody admired it. Eddie Van Halen is up there, I think, with John Coltrane in the originality department. I mean, he literally pioneered that two-handed tapping, which still goes on today in some regards in rock music. Eddie deserves that credential. He's a master and an innovator. So Alan certainly must have recognized that. You know, we never talked much about that sort of thing amongst ourselves. What do you think of this guy? That type of thing. I mean, but the respect was always there amongst the people that we hung with and jammed with and played with. I mean, it's a wonderful thing, man, when you share that kind of support for each other, because it's like memories that never go away. You play with people and their faces are smiling because you're playing well, and then my face and our faces are smiling because they're playing well.
Yeah, I've seen some photos from that era with you and Alan Holdsworth and Eddie Van Halen on stage together.
Right.
I've also seen some photos of you with David Lee Roth, and speaking of people born on Ego Avenue, huh?
Was David Lee Roth born on Eagle Avenue?
No, Ego Avenue.
Ego Avenue.
Well,
he was nice with me, and I think there are some pictures of us floating around. I was asked to join Van Halen, which I said no to.
Yeah.
I loved the band, but there's a sort of a lifestyle thing going on that I didn't wish to participate in. I'm not so mercenary as to take a gig merely for the money.
And did that mean Michael Anthony was going to become a roadie or just be tossed aside? Or
I hardly think a roadie. He's, in reflection, he was the best choice for that band that they had as a bassist, because he loved rock. He was into the show. You never see a Van Halen show with Michael Anthony where he isn't giving it his all. Mm-hmm. And that's what rock is about. I honestly felt that as a bass player and as a performing bass player and as a performing rock bass player, Michael Anthony was the choice for that group. I still think so. Plus, he sang great. And I would have given some really unique elements in the bass department, and I would have tried to live up to the, let's say, the credo of Van Halen virtuosity and love of their fans. These guys love their fans. They're grateful to their fans to this minute. They're not superstar snobs in rock. They love their fans. I know this. Mm-hmm. So when they give a show, they're embracing the people out in front. But I'm not sure I was capable of that in that regard. I could play the bass more in a John Entwistle style, stand there kind of quietly or kind of bobbing away and playing. But I couldn't leap very well, and I never knew how to play to the back of the room, which is really a secret of great rock success. You play to the full extent and dimensions of the theater or the arena, and I'm not sure I was going to be able to do that. But the band was into certain things, and I wasn't into certain things. No need to go further, and it was best if I didn't play. But a band is a tenuous situation to invest your career in, because generally they don't work. They generally don't have much longevity. But if it works and if it has longevity, there's nothing more musically rewarding, I think. You get to know your colleagues so well. The friendship thing becomes deep, and obviously there's maybe, hopefully, a good financial reward. So, a band is it. A band is it.
Well, speaking of bands, there's a band you already mentioned, Bruford, Bill Bruford's band, which was called Bruford. Not long after hearing Road Games, I heard the Bruford albums you did, Feels Good to Me, One of a Kind, my personal favorite, Gradually Going Tornado. And you did some lead vocals on that album. Is that something you volunteered for, or did they elect you to do that?
They elected me, and there's a good and bad in it. One, the good is I could hit a pitch. The bad is I have a lousy singing voice. I honestly felt John Wetton was a better singer. Greg Lake were better. They were better singers than me.
It was just odd to me in that I hadn't seen you as a singer on any projects before or after that. So. Well,
it's an interesting thing. The singing that I did in that record wasn't particularly my style. In the sense, what I mean is, I'm more of a balladeer. Even now, I'm actually better to sing a song like that. You know, that's more my style. And that band presented sort of a request. It wasn't natural for me. Interestingly, Peter Gabriel copied some of my singing style.
Yeah.
That fascinated me.
Well, yeah, those compositions were not, 12-bar blues. Let's just leave it at that.
Well, in the hands of Bill Bruford, they were probably more like 13-bar blues. I mean,
that's what
Bill would write these amazingly sort of odd and English-flavored compositions. It was a great, great band.
Yeah, never mind, the notes, just the phrasing would be tough just because of the rhythmic sense of all those compositions. But I thought you did fine. I didn't listen to it and go, oh, this is a weakness on the track. I had to read that it was you. I didn't know it was you. I read later, but I knew it wasn't Bill. Well, speaking of Bill Bruford, one of your more high-profile gigs was with Anderson, Bruford, Wakeman, and Howe. They couldn't call themselves Yes at the time for legal reasons, but if John Anderson, Rick Wakeman, Steve Howe, and Bill Bruford are on stage, for all practical purposes, it's Yes.
It certainly is, even though it technically probably required Chris Squire to be truly and completely Yes. But
well, it was originally Tony Levin's gig, and he played on the album they did, but when it came time to tour, he was ill, and the spot was offered to you.
Yes.
Did they give you any charts, or just expect you to learn the songs from the albums?
No, I learned the songs. It was an interesting call. I got it on a Sunday night, and on a Thursday night, 3 days later, I was on stage with them. And how it worked is I'm a very good transcriber and a very quick learner. So if I got an emergency call in the studios when I used to live in New York, the emergency call meant that they couldn't get a bassist or the bass parts that they had didn't work, and you come in. And for an odd sort of a career, I was the guy that came in and fixed up a lot of the bass parts from a lot of bass players when they made mistakes and went home. And still, they would call those bass players to play those gigs. And I was constantly going in and fixing bass parts. So it's a peculiar thing, but it helped me to hone the need to specify and learn music quickly. So I became a very good overdubber, and I became a very good fixerer of bass parts. And also, as a learning musician, I loved writing out jazz solos. My ear was good enough, and I was trained in it. So I had lots and lots of jazz solos that I would write out and play. And when I got the call, actually, it was Steve Howe that recommended me. Curiously, it wasn't Bill. And when I got the call, they told me on the phone the names of the records. I went out on Monday, bought them, wrote out charts, and was gigging with them a couple of days later. And it's all based on the training, or let's say the experience of fixing, repairing, overdubbing, writing out, learning bass parts on the move very quickly. And it's a peculiar thing that happened, and I got good enough, and I got the gig, and I toured with them playing Yes music.
Well, Chris Squire's bass parts are kind of unconventional, and some of the songs you were covering, like Heart of the Sunrise and Close to the Edge, for example, he drops notes in kind of unexpected places, and Yes has the kind of fans who will definitely notice if you fiddle around too much with his parts. So, did you try and stay kind of true to what he had played, or?
No, I fiddled. I'm a fiddler. I was a fiddler, and on a bass I fiddled. I stuck as true as was demanded of me by the band, because they have a right to get a performance out of me that fits what they want. But some of the stuff they asked me was so gosh darn weird, and frankly musically not to my liking, that I had to say I ignored them and just did what I wished. And they liked it. I mean, you contribute something of a nature that isn't immediately what you think of, but later you reflect on it, and you might find it has merit. So I was very fortunate, and I threw my own thing in there. Not a whole lot. It's still an exact show where they would play the same solos, the same lines every night, and I'm a jazz bass player, so I kind of didn't do that all the time.
Did the audiences react to you pretty warmly, or did you get a "How dare he presume to replace Chris Squire" vibe ever? Or?
No, more the contrary. People were astonishingly supportive.
Cool.
It actually kind of cracked me up. I'd be sitting there, and I'd hear like this cheering section, in the audience, yeah, I thought that was pretty darn amazing. I said, look at me, I'm a rock star for a couple of weeks.
Yeah. How did Tony Levin feel about it? He's got enough.
We never talked about it. I called him up and wished him well, and I saw him last summer in Sardinia. I played a gig with my band in Sardinia, and he was there. And interestingly, his brother is one of my best friends in the world. I know his brother, we were and are extremely close, Peter Levin. And Tony and I kind of, hello, how are you? And I'll see you. And it's always been like that. So actually, this trip in Sardinia, we hung out every day and spent time, and it was very nice.
Let me just back up to what you said about being the fixer in the studio.
Okay.
Were these bass players aware that their playing was being tampered with later, and were they aware it was you?
I'm not sure.
I'm guessing no.
I'm not sure. It was peculiar to me. There was a studio ethic that permeated the New York music scene in those days. First of all, there is not much of a studio scene anywhere anymore. When I was young, you could do 3 dates a day. And in the city, we constantly were doing jingles and TV and I don't know what, records and everything else. It was a heyday, and I was a part of it, and I'm so happy and grateful that I was in that. But there was a kind of a thing where you got the part done. Does it sound good? It sounds good. See you later. On to the next session. Mm-hmm. And curiously, I never functioned like that. If it didn't sound good, I wouldn't go until it did. But you could record these tracks rather quickly. They weren't like very complicated things, but we did jingles and dates and stuff. And the Brecker brothers would be there, and Steve Gadd would be on drums, and Eric Gale on guitar, and the New York kind of famous guys. A lot of the horns that you see on the Letterman, the whole Letterman band is made up of the guys that I used to play with in the 70s. Right. Anton Fig and I toured with Pat Martino and roomed together, and Will Lees, of course, we were buddies side by side. The horn section, they were part of the Blues Brothers band. And had I stayed in New York, I would have been in that clique, but I left.
I want to read a list of some of the musicians you've worked with over the years. Let's start with guitarist. We already mentioned Alan Holdsworth, Eddie Van Halen, and Steve Howe. You also worked with Frank Gambale, Scott Henderson, Pat Martino, you said, Frank Zappa, Paul Gilbert, Neil Schon, and John McLaughlin. For drummers, we mentioned Chad Wackerman and Bill Bruford. You've also worked with Steve Smith, Jeff Porcaro, Billy Cobham, Vinnie Colaiuta, Tristan Bowden, Danny Gottlieb, and Dennis Chambers.
Right.
Keyboards, you've worked with Rick Wakeman, Patrick Moratz, Bill Evans, and Chick Corea. And based on your Facebook photos, you seem to be on friendly terms with just about every elite bass player on the planet, including Stanley Clarke, Marcus Miller, Victor Wooten, Geddy Lee, Stuart Hamm, Tim Bogert, and Billy Sheehan. And you've also got pictures of yourself with Jaco Pastorius and John Entwistle, both who we've mentioned. So that's a pretty staggering list of ultra-talented players. And at the risk of sounding greedy, is there anyone you've always wanted to work with but you never had a chance to?
I always wanted to work with Wayne Shorter, who never called me. To be dead honest, a lot of guys don't want to work with me. Even now, I parlayed my name into a solo career and do records on my own and do quite well. My sort of sideman days have pretty well panned out because I worked so hard to make a statement as a bass player that I made the conclusion that a lot of guys simply don't want that kind of bass in their bands. So it's not as if I'll overplay. I mean, one has the musical sensibilities to restrain and fit. That's what music is about. It's not all about you. It's about the band, the music, etc. But a lot of guys, seemingly, would rather have a bassist not quite as strong as me.
Well, you can be in any band I'm in, and if I was to give your number out right now, the people listening, you'd be getting called off the hook. Because I don't know anybody who wouldn't want Jeff Berlin in their band in my circles.
Well, it's
I get
a
your point,
fascinating dichotomy here. I appreciate it. I played with a lot of these guys, but they want a bassist up to a certain level of excellence and no more than that.
And that's
what
weird.
I've done is,
That's weird to me.
Well, there is a logic in it because I'll point to Pat Metheny's situation. Pat Metheny is a guy who wants a bassist primarily to play under him and let him solo. That's what he wants. That's what he gets. That's his band. I mean, he plays with great musicians. He played with Christian McBride, who's a real virtuoso on upright. It's rare anymore, but he doesn't want any really much more than that. Steve Rodby was his bass player, who's an excellent bass player, but whose gig was for 15 years with Pat Metheny, 1 and 5. Boom, 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 boom. A lot of these guys prefer that. They really do. And they're within their rights to have it because they're band leaders. So I'm kind of on the outs because I played so strongly and have provided something I feel of such a distinct nature, people say that about me, that they just don't want it. They want a guy who's just rooting five so they can do their thing.
Well, let me put
and
it
I'm
this way.
speaking generally of the higher-pitched instruments.
Now, if the music suffers for having you, that's one thing. But if it's just a musician's ego suffering, I think that's lame. Like if somebody says, the music will be better if we have a better bass player, but I won't get all my 8-minute solos, so I don't want someone stealing my spotlight. That's what it sounds like to me. I have the highest regard for Pat Metheny. I'm not talking about him.
I love Pat. The last bassist, electric bassist he played of any kind of what I would call significant authority was Jocko in the 70s.
Right.